What we'll have to do is just recommend this song to you. It can be found on YouTube and Spotify. Porter's Gate has been doing a lot of worship music over the last number of years and developing music around justice and lamentations and other themes. So another album of music that I would highly recommend is one called Mercyland. And Phil Madera is an artist, singer, and he was working with Emmylou Harris on a tour, and says back when he was on this tour in 2008, he said, a really crazy TV preacher came on the satellite TV and caused me to wonder how to counterbalance this bad PR God continues to get from his own flock. So I came up with a simple idea of gathering together a few great musical artists singing songs written about the basic theme of what if God is love? It's not your traditional Christian type of music, but again, I really highly recommend it. Some songs, the first time you hear it, you may be a little bit offended, but I think that it's a challenging album. So Mercyland, Hymns for the Rest. And then another artist who sings a lot about mercy is a Quaker woman, Carrie Newcomer, who attended a Mennonite university in the United States. One of her songs, she talks about before and after. And really, it's a song about before and after experiencing mercy. So today we're going to have Matt Clarke talk about his latest book. For those who haven't met Matthew before, Matt is currently the president of the Anabaptist Association. This book just came out at the end of 22, Disrupting Mercy, the Gift of Extreme Kindness Motivated by Passion. And just a few quotes from the book before I turn it over to Matt. It said, the primary aim of this book is to encourage people, especially those who follow Jesus, to develop a posture that loves mercy. He works at defining mercy in the book and brings in other people's understanding of mercy. Throughout the book, he talks about what mercy is. Another quote, he says, the best we might hope for in some contexts is that mercy confuses people. I love that. He uses the story from Les Mis about how in that story, in Les Miserables, mercy confused people who were really stuck on a very legalistic way of living. So the best hope we have is that context that mercy confuses people, but do not underestimate the value of confusion. It is above and beyond what is expected. It is a higher form of justice than people are used to. It is non-transactional and non-conditional. In all those aspects, it is subversive, implicitly calling into question many of the accepted norms of our world. And then mercy is the disruption that reorients us towards shalom and the driving force that makes the good news good news. So at this point, I will turn it over to Matt to talk about his book, talk a little bit maybe about why you wrote the book, what kind of reception it's had since it's been out, and anything else you'd like to share with us. So I'll shut up and turn it over to Matt.
Great, thanks, Mark. That's a good introduction. You picked some really good quotes there that really did pull out the key ideas of the book really nicely. I'm going to share a screen for a couple of slides, but not for the most of the talk. We'll put the slides aside and just talk to each other. But just for a minute, I want to show you a couple of slides. I want to go back to the book cover to say a couple of words about it. So you'll notice that the book is co-written by Annabella and me. I did the actual writing of the words, but it all comes out of conversations between Bella and I. So it really is a joint effort. None of this would have been even formulated if it wasn't that we were married and working together in the kind of ministry that we're trying to do. Yes, she is.
And I am on the side.
The cover artwork features a plate that we used at our wedding. You'll notice it's been broken and fixed in the manner of the Japanese kintsugi style. We see that as a bit of a metaphor for how mercy works, that mercy is like the gold filling in the plate that takes something that's broken and makes it something that's even more precious. So that's part of the theme of the book as well. The word disrupting, I deliberately chose to be ambiguous in the title because what we wanted to do in the book is, on one hand, we wanted to disrupt normal ideas on mercy. We thought that the common understandings of that word are very weak and not reflective of the radical stance of the Bible on mercy. And so we wanted to disrupt what people are normally thinking about mercy in order to replace it by a form of mercy which we think itself is highly disruptive. Mercy we see as something that's outrageous, even scandalous, because of its extreme, surprising generosity and its non-transactional, non-debt-inducing freedom as a gift. If I jump ahead, I wanted to show you the table of contents for those who haven't seen the book, just so you can see the kind of topics that are covered in the book. We start with the story of Zacchaeus, and then I use that as the basis for trying to pull out my own sort of definition of mercy, which is a bit idiosyncratic. We'll come to that in a minute. And then I have a couple of chapters on looking at how mercy is expressed in the Bible, look at the supposed opposition or conflict between mercy and justice, and I try to dissolve that conflict and say, no, the two work hand in hand. And then there's 4 chapters on the way how mercy resolves different aspects of our human brokenness. In particular, how mercy addresses sin, how it addresses different forms of bondage. And the chapter that I want to focus on in this session over the next half an hour is the chapter on exile. So I'll come back to that in some detail. And then I talk a little bit about the limits of mercy. How does it work in extreme situations like human trafficking, which is our research space? How could you possibly be merciful to enemies and pedophiles and human traffickers? If the idea of mercy that we're trying to put into practice in our lives as disciples of Jesus is some weak sort of notion, then it won't stand up in those extreme contexts. So I wanted to test how my definition of mercy would inform our behaviours, our interactions in even those worst of possible cases. And then you'll see there's a chapter on the obstructions to mercy. When does mercy not work? What makes it not effective or absent in so many ways from our modern world? And then there's a chapter where I wrap up some themes. There's a quite extensive appendix in which I look at other people's understandings of morals, of mercy. So there's, I don't know, 40 or 50 pages in that appendix where I do a historic run through of different people's approaches to mercy, which form the background to the formulation of my own thinking on it. So that's the overview. The next thing is I want to pose the question, what is mercy? And just maybe pause for you to think about that yourself. We can have Q&A at the end, but I'll just try to get through this to cover the basic ground before that. But if you have an urgent question, please jump in, put your hand up, or just start talking, and we'll have a discussion. But the first thing just to think about for a minute is, what's your own background? How would you define mercy? What examples have you seen where you've witnessed mercy, or you've received mercy, or you've offered mercy to someone else? What does that look like? What are the contexts that mercy has been experienced in your life? And as I say, the book takes a bit of an idiosyncratic approach to defining mercy. And my definition goes like this, that mercy is a gift of extreme kindness motivated by compassion. And I spend a fair bit of the book explaining the aspects of that definition and giving examples of it and trying to motivate why this is an appropriate biblical way of looking at mercy. But I'm not going to get into that today either, but maybe a simplified version of that is for us to think that mercy is compassion in action. Mercy is compassion in action. It starts with this visceral sense of compassion for someone's need, but it's always active. And that might be the difference between compassion and mercy. Compassion's the feeling, mercy is the action that comes out of that feeling. Anyone want to make comments on that? Is that similar, radically different to how you would have approached mercy?
Okay, I'll just jump in there. Thanks.
Yeah, Lucy. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm extremely interested in this topic. It's very, very in the vibes at the moment, in a lot of circles that I am connected with, and particularly even the last few days. So I was thrilled that your book, your and Bella's book was being showcased today. Interesting, the word compassion, because ION on the end of word means the act of. So compassion should be an action word. I'm not trying to correct you there, don't get me wrong. But I think it's great that you've brought out that aspect of activity, actual, getting in there alongside whatever the situation is. And you said that the extreme kindness, because I think that the Jewish word hesed, or CHESED, God's loving kindness, is tied in with the aspect of mercy. So thanks so much for clarifying that.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Well, the way I present mercy, I talk about it as having 3 levels of operation. So this kind of mercy that I'm thinking about, which is more than just being kind to each other and more than just expressing kindness to our friends and the people we like, it's a bit more a bigger issue than that. It's going beyond and above what's normally expected. And I think mercy does 3 things. It, first of all, addresses some immediate need, and that need might be varied as much as we can imagine. It might be a physical need, a broken leg. It might be a mental or psychological need. It might be a broken relationship. It might be something to do with a moral brokenness. So the need that mercy addresses is varied. And so mercy somehow jumps in because of the compassion that we have to try to alleviate or ameliorate the effects of the immediate need that we see someone in. But secondly, mercy is disruptive. Mercy can jar people because of its surprising extravagance, so that they think, wow, did I deserve that? Why did that person go out of their way to do that for me, like the Good Samaritan? What? Oh, I'll have to rethink the whole situation here. Who am I? Am I really worthy of that, of receiving that mercy? And that jarringness, that disruption can provide opportunities for transformation in the way it did for Zacchaeus. Jesus called Zacchaeus down from the tree and said outrageously, I'm going to have dinner with you, in complete opposition to the crowd that was gathered around, for whom Zacchaeus was an outcast. And the moment Jesus said, I'm going to your place for dinner, Jesus became the outcast. It was an outrageous act which was radically transformative for Zacchaeus. But then the third level of mercy, I think, is the cosmic plan that comes under the mission of God for humanity to reconcile all things in heaven and earth in Christ. And I think mercy is the key driver, key tool, key process that Jesus and God uses in order to bring about the reconciliation of all things. I said that in the book I spent a few chapters looking at how mercy addresses various forms of human brokenness. I pick up an idea here from Marcus Borg. And Marcus Borg, in his analysis of the theme of salvation in the Bible, says that there are 3 what he calls macro stories of salvation woven throughout all of the stories in the biblical text. He says one area of salvation is how God addresses sin. And he says that God's response to sin is forgiveness. And he says that's a very important theme in the Bible, or macro story, but it's not the only one. And he says in some areas of the church, we fixate on that story of salvation at the cost of the others that are also equally there. And he says there's equal importance in the Bible to the trajectory of from bondage to liberation, that part of human brokenness is that in various ways we are in bondage. And the story of the Exodus is a key point in the Old Testament where God liberates or redeems people from slavery in Egypt. So physical slavery is a type of bondage, but also addictions are a kind of bondage. Being put in prison is a kind of bondage, and Jesus came to release people from prison. And so there's this story woven throughout the Bible about how God acts in human history to liberate people from whatever form of bondage they find themselves in. And then thirdly, there's the macro story that recognizes that people find themselves in exile, and in exile in many ways. And I want to spend a bit more time looking at this particular theme. Israel was in exile, but we often find ourselves lost. Jesus' story about finding lost things is part of this exile narrative. People don't feel that they belong, that they mightn't belong in their own bodies, that they're marginalized from society, that there's a sense that they're not at home anywhere on earth. And that's the ongoing story of exile, which started from our banishment from the Garden of Eden, but of course ends in the city of God that comes down to earth in Revelation, where there's the end of the journey home, where we all find our place in the new heaven and earth created by God at the end of time, and where everything is truly reconciled in heaven and earth through Christ. And that's the ultimate return home from our human exile. Now, I want to say that mercy plays a key role in each of these three trajectories, that it's mercy which allows God to resolve sin. And forgiveness, in effect, is what mercy looks like in the context of sin. Liberation is what mercy looks like in the context of bondage. And enabling the journey home is what mercy looks like in the context of human brokenness in exile. Now, where do I go from there? I'm going to stop the screen sharing. I think I've finished here so that I can just talk to you face to face. And I want to say a bit more about mercy in exile. And then I thought I'd read a couple of pages from the book, so you get a flavour of my narrative style in the book. Exile in the Bible starts with Eden, as I said, but it's a major theme as Israel gets exiled to Assyria, and parts of the Jewish people just disappear. We don't know what happens to them then. But then later on, the whole nation is exiled again in a couple of movements into Babylon. Then the New Testament picks up the same sort of theme and talks about the church living in Babylon in a symbolic way, and that we are all aliens here. The same idea applies to refugees in our modern world, people who, for political or from natural disasters, have lost their home and are displaced, homeless, and cast adrift in a world, in countries where they no longer belong. Homelessness in our own culture is a form of exile, as is other types of social marginalization and different types of identity confusion, gender dysphoria, I see as other personal types of exile, that we don't know who we are, we don't belong, we don't have a community, we're in some sense lost. And I think exile is a good way to describe the sense that we do not belong here. We find ourselves estranged from God, from each other, and from the land. We're alienated from ourselves, lost, and hungry for home, yearning to grasp our true identity and to find a place where we belong. Exile is, in that sense, the human condition that we all experience. So with that as background, I'm going to turn, if anyone's got the book, I'm on page 186, where I talk about the journey home as God's merciful approach to dealing with our sense of exile. And so I start that section by saying, in the biblical narrative, God's merciful response to our physical, psychological, and spiritual exile is to enable the journey home. Mercy addresses the experience of exile on multiple levels. And I go through 4 different levels, and there's only one that I'm going to emphasize particularly in this speech. The first level is that for exiles, mercy can address the immediate needs of people while they're in exile. So if some refugees arrive in Australia, it can be an act of mercy to help to welcome them, to give them visas, to give them a home, to help them with language, to find them gainful employment, to meet their psychological grief, having lost their homeland. So those things can be acts of mercy that we can give to meet the immediate need of refugees or other people in exile. The second the second level of where mercy addresses exile is in helping the possibility of people returning home. And for many, that's the most obvious need of refugees or people who are, in some sense, unhomed, is to find them a way back to their physical home. But as Israel found, when they got back from Babylon, they got back into their home country and they found that it wasn't the home that they had remembered. They had changed, the country had changed, and they were still embroiled in political and religious turmoil. And there was a growing sense in the later prophets that although they'd returned home, spiritually they were still in exile. And so the third level of how mercy might address exile is not just for a physical return home, but to respond to people's deeper psychological needs, to enable what's a deeper, more real return home. And in the book, I give a couple of examples, and I want to read two of those examples to you. One of them is Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in John chapter 4. It's a good example of how Jesus showed mercy to someone who was socially marginalized, who didn't have a clear cultural identity, and for those reasons was in exile. So the woman was a Samaritan drawing water at midday on her own, an outcast from an already disparaged group. So the Samaritans were already sort of sidelines. They were second-rate Jews. Although an exile in her own community, she was the first person to whom Jesus revealed his identity as Messiah. Rather than ignoring, dismissing, or talking down to her, Jesus engaged with her in a genuine conversation, and she was changed. But her change was a result of Jesus' kindness, not a precondition for it. And that just echoes one of the other themes of the book, that mercy does not have any preconditions. You do not have to deserve mercy. You just have to have a need that mercy can address through a compassionate action. The simple kindness of a conversation may not seem very extreme to us, but in the context, a Jewish man and an ostracized Samaritan woman, this is a radical and highly subversive act. He surprises her with his willingness to engage with her, with his candor, with his affirmation of her inherent value, and with his supernatural knowledge of her situation. A lot of preaching imposes moral judgment onto this story, supposing that the unnamed woman to be a prostitute or an adulterer. But neither Jesus nor John say a word of criticism about her. John notes the scandal of Jesus talking to a Samaritan and a woman, but he doesn't raise any issue about her being sinful. Jesus does say to her, "You have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." But that doesn't cast blame on her. Perhaps she was at fault. But in the cultural context, it's equally possible that she was married very young to an older man who subsequently died. Perhaps that a brother was required by Deuteronomical law to take on the husbandly duties of his dead brother, and that one or more husbands found something objectionable about her and chose to divorce her by simply saying, "You're divorced," in accordance with Deuteronomy 24:1. Jesus may well have been saying to her with compassion rather than with judgment, "I know how much abuse you have suffered through 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is no better than any of the rest." Jesus doesn't bring her multiple partners into the conversation to accuse her or to shame the woman. On the contrary, Jesus names the shame that she carries so that through being named and acknowledged, the shame can be purged. All of this is an expression of mercy from Jesus. He saw her in exile and compassionately helped her find a way home. The effect is so affirming and energizing that she returns home as an evangelist. And furthermore, she's sufficiently respected that, quote, many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. A remarkable story. And then a little bit later in the chapter, and I'm going to close with this before some Q&A time, I write this still in the context of how Jesus and God deals mercifully with exile. The Indigenous nations in Australia exemplify a more complex situation in that they live physically in their homeland and yet are dispossessed of it. They're effectively in exile within their own land. As with many dispossessed people, the restoration of their rightful land is an issue of justice rather than mercy. They need relevant social and political recognition, altered legal status, a fair hearing, and formal treaties. It would not be an act of mercy for the descendants of colonial occupation to acknowledge that ownership of Australian land was never ceded by the traditional custodians. That would simply be fair and ethical. Many colonisers have acted with mercy towards Indigenous people, but the more common and substantial form of mercy in the Australian context is something even more surprising: the extreme kindness and the patience expressed by generations of Indigenous people to their oppressors. That was evident in early examples of Indigenous people showing European settlers where to find drinkable water. It continues to be evident in their ongoing restraint and willingness to engage peacefully. That display of mercy by a disempowered minority of the current Australian population is deeply costly, uncomfortable, and disruptive. Whether the mercy will be received and understood by my own cultural peers who constitute the majority of Australians' population, and whether it's disruptive enough to transform us to pursue justice, they remain open questions. Nevertheless, the establishment of shalom in Australia will owe its success first and foremost to that sustained mercy, and only secondarily to any legislative changes that might be inspired by the mercy. A purely legal solution might leave hearts and discriminatory attitudes unchanged. But if the mercy shown to the colonising majority inspires a new commitment to justice for the Indigenous minority, then legal changes can be crafted to encourage the true shalom in which all of us can flourish. I address one other issue in this chapter, and that's the fourth level of mercy I see God applying to the problem of exile, and that's the ultimate resolution of exile in the biblical narrative, which, as we noted, started with our banishment from paradise, but ends with our citizenship in the city of God. And so that, I think, is the deeper fourth level at which mercy is one of God's instruments for resolving the exile that we all experience in one way or another. So I hope that gives you the flavour of the book. It doesn't tell you the whole story, but I hope that might encourage you to think more about mercy yourself. Bella and I are going to be spending most of this year travelling and hosting discussions on mercy and also on human trafficking, which is not disconnected, because there is deep mercy required to bring some resolution to the ongoing problem of human trafficking. I'll open the floor now to comments and questions from you. And so Bella has the floor first.
Yeah, excellent. This is why I go to the side, so I don't talk too much. One of the things I just wanted to say that was to invite you all for further discussion. I mean, today we don't have much time, but we really do want to travel around and meet lots of you face to face. And when we say we'd like to host, we're actually asking you to host the conversation. We will come to you. So we would love you to put up your hand and say, look, I'm going to gather 10 or 12 people around a meal table. Please come and spend some time with us. And we would love to do that. We're happy to go to Tasmania. We're happy to go to New Zealand. Like, we really have, we're in a lovely position that we're able to sell our business, some part of our business. And so we have some freedom this year, and we want to be generous with our time and our travel. But we do need you to gather your friends, your family, in your churches, in your local communities, you know, grab people together in your lounge rooms around a meal table. And we're asking you to be the host or the hostesses. We just one word these days, isn't it? To be the host. And we would just love to come and spend some time with you. So, and that's a real invitation.
Okay. Anyone want to unmute and say a few other words?
Yeah, thanks, Matt and Bella. I've read the book on my Kindle, and I felt it. Yeah, I suppose I was surprised how engaging I got engaged with your writing. it's almost a page. It was almost a page turner with me. Once I got, into chapter 4, and so I can thoroughly recommend it to anyone that's might be thinking of having a read. And yes, I think I said, maybe it's a life changing, maybe it's a life changing, potentially a life changing text to me. But yeah, so it's and to bring out so much biblical, support for practicing mercy, it's very, very challenging. But particularly your ability to communicate, it was a great blessing.
Thanks, Bruce.
Also, with the hop in now, just in case, the Samaritan woman at the well, I understand in the Orthodox tradition, they actually gave her a sainthood, and they've got other writings around her life. It surprised me, actually. It's in their tradition and in their writings and their teachings.
As a member of Extinction Rebellion, one of the motivating issues is the lack of mercy that we have towards the land. Would you like to make a comment on that, Matt?
Yeah, look, I skip over that. I mentioned that connection a couple of times, but only in very brief passing. It's not an area that I've thought a lot about, Ross. I'm committed to an ecologically positive outlook to theology, but it hasn't dominated a lot of my thinking, and I haven't done a lot of reading about it. So it hasn't been a central enough focus that I felt that I could say anything intelligent about it. But any ideas that you've got off the top of your head there, Ross?
I guess also what motivates me is my concern for my children and grandchildren, which is, I guess, an element of mercy.
Yeah, mercy not just to the land, but to your descendants, to the future generations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, look, that bears more thinking about for sure. And one of the things that Bella and I are hoping to do during this year as we travel around discussing mercy with people is that we'll collect stories along the way and perhaps publish more like a practitioner's handbook that's full of people's experiences of mercy. And it would be good to include in there some stories of people's engagement with ecological change and mercy to the land. Yeah.
How do we motivate people to engage in this whole capacity of being merciful? How do we break this hard core that some people seem to have, or society seems to have, in terms of a lack of mercy towards not just one another, but and the marginalized and the rejected? But how do we? What thoughts do you have? And not just you, Matthew, but also others who are looking on. How do we motivate people to become more merciful?
I've got a few thoughts there. One is that, there's a growing understanding that our society isn't very kind, and that it's good to be more caring and kind to each other. There's a lot of books about that. Hugh Mackay from Australia has got a book on kindness, but there's a dozen more books on encouraging people to be kinder. And I have deliberately placed the idea of mercy as something beyond kindness, that it's more extreme, that it's something that is unexpected, can't be required. It's above and beyond what could be expected, in the way that Jesus said, look, if someone hits you on the cheek, let them hit you on the other side. And if the soldier asks you to carry his pack 1 mile, carry it 2. That, for me, as a follower of Jesus, there's a call to something more than just being kind and caring to the people around me. There's a call to do something unexpectedly generous. And that, for me, is part of the habit of becoming Christ-like. And so I can think about how to encourage it for people who share that idea that they're followers of Christ. I can think about how to motivate them towards greater mercy. And it takes a fair bit of dedication, because we can want to be merciful but make mistakes and screw things up and think we're helping but actually hurt someone. And so it takes practice, dedication, learning to develop both the love of mercy and also the wisdom on how to act mercifully in the right ways. But the other thing I'd add in there is that I think a lot of people have trouble showing mercy because they have trouble receiving mercy. And so I think part of the way to motivate people to become merciful is to be continually and surprisingly showing them mercy, so that it disrupts their life to the point where they re-examine their transactional worldview, that they start thinking maybe life is not about I'll do this if you do that, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and I'm only going to do this if I get something out of it for myself. But that the generosity of God's gift to us overflows in what I've called in the book a network of reciprocity, that the gift of mercy is spread around amongst us all without an expectation that we get anything back. But in the end, it all goes around, and as gifts do, we receive ourselves as part of the social tapestry that's held together by mercy. So I do think that the lack of ability to receive mercy is often a blockage, because and we've got to shake people out of some of their core assumptions about life and relationships. Any others have thoughts on that one? How would we motivate people to become merciful?
I was thinking just that, even reminding times of when someone has been merciful to them, because it's embarrassing sometimes to receive mercy, because we don't feel like, well, because we don't deserve it. We don't feel like we deserve it. And so, but reminding people of that is kind of a way to get them to accept it and then be able to give that out to someone else.
Yeah, you've pulled so many wonderful threads together. Thank you, Matthew, in your discussions with Bella that germinated this project. One of the things I think that sticks with me about, you're mentioning about God's gift to us, etc., is I remember being in some sort of group where we were looking at mercy, and it was brought out that mercy was actually in the fabric of creation, like, because it's in God's self that mercy is actually there, whereas we often think, oh, it had to be added later because things went awry and had to be fixed. But I think what you've said really flows in with that idea, and the justice aspect of it. Like I'm reading a book about it's called Holy Disruption, about prophetic, a very balanced view of prophetic, and it mentions the terms of the loving kindness, the justice, that social action, and the shalom all together. And I think mercy is a wonderful way that you've tied it all together. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment, because I was thinking along the lines of justice myself with refugees and boat people, and how we sort of indifferent to their circumstances that have caused them to leave family and home.
Yeah. And Ross, coming back to your ecological question, there's a great sense in which the creation is a gift to us from God, and creation itself is continually giving to us.
Yes.
One could perhaps think about the mercy that we are constantly receiving from the earth, the surprising and outrageous generosity of the earth to us, despite our continual abuses of that gift.
Yes. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm going to round up. Mark?
Yeah, let me jump in here at this point. I don't think we have time for the music, which if you can maybe share the link for that, and people can use that for the meditation. Unfortunately, today the technology hasn't worked well for us on that. But let me just, do you have the link on that you can just put that up on the screen so people can see that?
I can put the link in the chat. I was going to play a piece of music. It's an instrumental by Max Richter with a video by his wife, Yulia Ma, and the piece of music is called Mercy, and I'll put a link to the YouTube in the chat. And I was going to get us just to listen meditatively to that and reflect on the mercy that's shown through both the beautiful music and amazing video imagery that Yulia put together. So I'll copy the links just now.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me just say a word about some of the upcoming First Saturdays that we're planning. Next month, we're going to be looking at the issue of Christian nationalism. And Drew Strait, who is a professor at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary in the States, we're going to be listening to a half-an-hour presentation by him. He's going to be teaching a course online on Christian nationalism coming up later this year. He's also had a chapter in this book called Living the King Jesus Gospel, which is a series of essays in honor of Scott McKnight. And Drew Strait is one of the editors of this, and his chapter in here is From Salvation Culture to Peace Culture, Luke's Gospeling of Christ's Peace. So we'll be listening to him next month. And then some of the others that we have planned, Gracie Schrock-Hurst is a mission worker living in the slums of Jakarta and has written a book called Beyond Our Walls, Serving God in the Slums. And we hope to have her talk about what it's like to be living among the poor of the poor. And she's working with Servants to Asia's Urban Poor. So we'll be looking at that theme. We are also going to be hearing from either Stuart Murray Williams or somebody else who is connected with Anabaptist church planting in the UK, and looking at that whole theme of what's it look like to be planting Anabaptist churches. Dave Kramer is a professor also at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries, and he's written a book on Christian nonviolence. And we hope to have him on talking about that, what Christian nonviolence looks like today. Also, in this whole theme of creation care, Mary and I are also part of another network called Wellspring Community. And later in the year, we're bringing out one of the leaders of the Iona community. And we're setting up a whole series of discussions around Australia with the leaders of the Iona community and Aboriginal Christian leaders, talking about creation care, what it looks like from a Celtic perspective, what it looks like from an Aboriginal perspective. And we're hoping to have a presentation on what it looks like from an Anabaptist perspective. So Doug Kaufman, who is works in the whole area of creation care for the Mennonite Church in the U.S., he'll either be here live or do a presentation for us around that theme. So those are some of the issues we're going to be looking at in the months ahead. We're still trying to firm up some of the dates, so I don't have solid dates on all of those. Beginning of April, we're hoping to have a look at Easter spirituality and what that looks like. So those are some of the themes that we're working on for this year. If you have suggestions, people that you think would be really good to come on and talk with us about an issue, please just send us an email and what those suggestions are, and we'll work on that